The world of independent headphone manufacturers is more competitive than ever. We have places like Modhouse Audio, Airbus Acoustics, Hi-Fi for All, and Aurorus, now with the Quazar, their flagship upgrade to the Borealis. Let's talk about it. Quazar has some good and some bad. It's a really interesting headphone overall, and I'm wearing the Sennheiser HG800S today, which I'm going to refer back to later in this video. Quazar has an interesting mix of elements. Some parts are 3D printed, some are not, but overall it is a, in my opinion, build upgrade from the Borealis. I would say substantially so. The seat belt is gone with a 3D printed suspension strap instead, and it actually feels pretty decent on the top of the headband. The adjustable clicks are very solid, very satisfying on the headband. They can fold in, which is nice, becomes pretty compact. There's good retention for the tilt, and there is not really much swivel. You can kind of do this, but it's very, very tight. I'm sure this could be loosened with the screw right here, but you probably don't want to do that. I imagine they have it set to a specific tensioning. When I am adjusting that, there is a bit of flex right here in these arms. So if I'm trying to swivel it, get a little bit of flex there. That's probably fine. These materials, I believe this is probably like nylon PA11, PA12. It's plenty strong. It should hold up to it, and it will flex just a little bit. I'm not super worried about that. Pad size seems comparable to the Borealis. We have about 57 millimeters of vertical space. At the back, we've got 25 millimeters of depth, and at the front, we have about 16 millimeters of depth. It's not a very big ear pad on the inside, at least not vertically. It does compress the top and bottom of my ears a little bit, and I do not have large ears. That is a complaint I had with Bori also, but it's certainly not the worst thing ever. I imagine there's plenty of people that won't be bothered by it. It does stay on the head better than Borealis did, though it is quite heavy. On their site, they listed it 483 grams. Without the cable, I weighed this set against a reference weight and got 490 to 491 grams. So pretty dang heavy for a dynamic driver headphone, but that's not too uncommon. Other things are heavy. The ZMFs and things like that, other headphones that I have reviewed positively, are still pretty heavy, but it is definitely not light. Now this does have a different driver than what they used in Borealis. This one is a 300 ohm driver, custom 50 millimeter dynamic drivers with a proprietary graphene PET diaphragm and dual magnet magnetic circuit. It's an interesting way to word that. Again, 300 ohms, and they are hand assembled in the USA at $1,500 US. Not a ton more to say about the build and ergo on it. I think we should talk about the sound. And what it really boils down to, sound-wise, is I prefer the Borealis. The Borealis was a bit more mid-range focused. It was very dynamic sounding in the bass, and it was a little bit darker through the ear gain. This is the opposite. It's a lot more treble focused, and it is much less dynamic. I would say it kind of has the dynamics of like the older DCAs, so like the original Noir or the Closed X, but this is a much brighter headphone than the original Bori. In fact, the reason I wanted to wear the HG800S today is because side by side, this is actually notably brighter than an HG800S, which is pretty wild. The big difference being this has the entire treble region for the most part elevated, minus some kind of dips here and there, versus things like the HG800S, it's more of just kind of like the upper treble that are a bit elevated. And as a result of this, it ends up sounding pretty well articulated. It's just a lot of treble. Beyerdynamic has entered the chat and they would like to know your location. Let's have a look at some measurements here. So first things first, this is the left-right channel balance for the Quazar. I took this channel balance on the Brüel & Kjær 4128C head and torso simulator. We'll talk about the actual frequency response elements later. The channel balance on these is actually pretty good. They come within like a decibel and a half of each channel. So I'd say that's to be expected. That's pretty solid channel balance, especially for a hand-assembled product. Here is the HPTF between the Brüel & Kjær rig and Meyer. As you can see, we actually are pretty decent in the bass and low mid-range, and then around 800 hertz things start elevating. We have a pretty substantial bump there, around 1 kilohertz to 2 kilohertz. We dip back down, then come back up. dip back down, then come back up. We end up going pretty high up in the treble, especially around like 10K. There is a range of variation, so if you're on the lower end of this variation, at least the middle ear gain between, say, like maybe 3 and 8 kilohertz could be within sort of an acceptable range, but you're pretty much almost always going to get a pretty hefty peak around 10K and a good bit of elevation around that 1 to 2 kilohertz region. As a result of that, it ends up sounding pretty bright and pretty shouty. If you just apply a blanket shelf and pull the entire region 1K and up down by maybe 3 decibels, it helps a fair bit. 4 decibels, even more. And as a comparison point, I'd like to show you the original headphone they developed, their first open back, the Borealis. Was it their first open back? Regardless, Borealis is the headphone we're comparing to today. This is the Borealis here in the reddish pink line. I'm gonna stick to red for this. Anyway, you can see some similarities. Borealis, very similar through the bass, very similar in the mid-range. It has another bump right there around 1 kilohertz, but it's substantially less exaggerated and doesn't climb all the way up to 2 kilohertz like it does on Quasar. And then Borealis has sort of that recession throughout the ear gain region. Then above that, we start to get peaks and dips that dip below the average listener preference bounds and then back up into it. So Bore was a bit more of a kind of mid-forward, dark and warm headphone. Again, known for its dynamics, known for a bit of bass presence, but more for being a mid-range and vocal focus headphone. And then Quasar being, even though they're similar in the bass and low mid-range, since Quasar has so much more treble elevation, you really don't hear that bass nearly as much. It sounds pretty lean on the bass in comparison to Borealis. I really would have loved to have something from them that is kind of a middle ground between the two headphones, especially in the treble, from like 2 kilohertz and up. If it was somewhere right in between these, it would be excellent. Both headphones I feel like could do from less emphasis around 1 kilohertz, but if they could have brought that 1K bump down and then had somewhere meeting in the middle between these two headphones, you would have something really, truly excellent in a lot of these ranges. Again, I prefer the dynamics a lot more on Borealis, and I don't really feel like we're getting much dynamics out of Quasar. That's probably something I would have liked more out of the Bore. But I'm sure there are going to be people who want a much more treble-focused headphone like this, and at least we're looking at treble that is more elevated across the entire region instead of just one narrow peak, like a Bear Dynamic or something like that. As a comparison point, I just want to show you this next to the HD800S. Again, this is a notably brighter headphone overall than the HD800S. In fact, by comparison, the HD800S is actually a warm headphone, which is very interesting. And the HD800S has always been a little bit warm, but people tend to refer to it usually as a more lean, bright headphone. And looking at this, you would think that by comparison, the HD800 would just be this woolly, warm, cozy headphone compared to the Quasar being notably more treble focused and upper mid-range focused as well. None of this is to dunk on the headphone. I think that it actually does have some cool elements to it, especially in the build. But I do think that more companies like this need to actually start paying attention to the measurements. Not saying your headphone needs to measure a very specific way, but it's worth paying attention to. Cases like this are a good example of why developing only by ear is not really a reliable way to go if you want to have a consistently good result. And regardless as to whether or not you're following a target, I think that you should be using some sort of data to evaluate your product, at least have data be in the room when you're developing it. That said, I'm sure that these are going to perform well in a niche part of the market. Aurorus has always had an interesting aesthetic, and they are still around, so clearly they have an audience who wants to buy their products. Quasar, though, is not going to get my recommendation at $1,500 US, though I do appreciate the opportunity to cover it. I do want to thank my patron chat member, Mahi, for sending in this headphone to let me review it. I do think that with some EQ, maybe a tube amp, you could get some cool results out of this. Like I said, I do actually like it if I shelve down the entire upper mid-range and treble region by like 3 to 4 decibels. But I do still kind of miss the dynamics of the old Bore. Anyway, that's going to wrap up this video, guys. If you liked it, leave a like down below. If you want to see early access to some of my other videos, you can check them out at the float plane at the link in the video description. I have a million more things in the works. A million might be an exaggeration. It's a lot of videos. You may have seen this in the corner. This is coming soon. This is the HDB 630. The review on that is going to be very interesting. All right, don't forget to stick around, subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Until next one, guys. Peace.